So, have you ever tried to make sense of what different belief systems say about the end of the world? It can feel incredibly complicated, right? You've got all these symbols, timelines. It's a lot to wrap your head around. Today, we're going to dive into one specific framework from Christian theology and take a look at a really unique way of interpreting what some believe is still to come. But hang on, before we start jumping into future events and prophecies, let's ask a much more basic question. Why does any of this even matter right now? According to the source material we're looking at, this isn't just some abstract puzzle. Nope. It's a study that's actually meant to have a huge impact on how people live their lives today. And that's a fair question, isn't it? Why would you spend time studying ancient prophecies about the future? It can seem totally disconnected from our daily lives. But the author we're exploring insists that understanding the end of the story is actually essential for living a meaningful life in the present. In fact, our source lays out 6 key reasons, and they go way beyond just, satisfying our curiosity. So let's break down the motivation behind this whole field of study. Okay, so the very first reason is actually framed as a promise. The source points right to this verse from the book of Revelation. The argument is that God didn't just reveal these future events for no reason, but actually attached a specific blessing to anyone who reads and hears them. It's kind of like an open invitation to understand what's going on. The second reason is really practical. In this view, these prophecies are sort of like a roadmap for right now. The idea is, by understanding these signs of the times, believers are supposed to live more intentionally, instead of, as the source puts it, just sleeping through life. And the final 4 reasons, they all kind of funnel into this one big idea: purpose. It's all about finding hope that looks beyond your current situation, knowing there's a triumphant end to the story, getting motivated for your work and your mission right here on Earth, and ultimately having a message of faith to share. So the big takeaway here is that studying the end is really meant to fuel a life of purpose in the present. Okay, so we've covered the why. Now let's get our terms straight. To really get a handle on this specific framework, we've got to define what we're actually talking about. The main term you're going to hear is eschatology. I know, it sounds super academic, right? But it's actually pretty simple. It comes from the Greek word eskatos, which just means last things. So when you hear eschatology, just think the study of what the Bible says about the end of this current age and the beginning of the next one. Simple as that. Now, this is really important. There isn't just one single view on eschatology. There are a bunch of them. The source material we're digging into today comes from a very specific one. It is a mouthful, I'll warn you, but it's called dispensational premillennialism. Let's break down what that actually means. So this slide lays out the core beliefs. First, this view sees God as having 2 separate, distinct plans, one for the nation of Israel and one for the church. Its main rule for reading prophecy is take it literally, unless that's just impossible. It also holds to what's called a pre-tribulation rapture, which is the idea that the church gets removed from the earth before a future 7-year crisis period. And all of that is followed by a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. So where does that dispensational part of the name come from? Well, it comes from this timeline. This framework basically divides all of biblical history into these different eras, or dispensations, where God deals with humanity in unique ways. As you can see, it kind of maps out this whole progression from innocence in the Garden of Eden through periods like law and grace, and then it looks forward to a future kingdom age. Okay, so if that's the framework, how does someone actually read the prophetic texts inside of it? Well, the source lays out a really clear set of rules to make sure the interpretation stays consistent. The number 1 foundational rule is this: start with the literal meaning. You should read the text at face value unless doing that would create a clear contradiction or something just plain absurd. Only then should you start looking for a symbolic meaning. And this quote right here illustrates the second key principle, and it's all about humility. The source uses this verse to argue against getting lost in wild speculation. The idea is to focus on what has been clearly revealed in the text and not get bogged down trying to predict or sensationalize the secret things that, well, are secret for a reason. This framework also leans on a few other key rules of the road. For instance, you can't just interpret one passage in a vacuum. It has to fit with the whole Bible. The New Testament is seen as the key that unlocks the Old. And this one's really interesting. It recognizes that some prophecies might actually have 2 fulfillments, a smaller one that already happened in the past and a bigger one that's still to come. And finally, one last super important principle from the source is to stay open-minded, and please avoid setting dates on a calendar. The author is really clear that even with this detailed framework, God might fulfill prophecy in ways nobody expects. So at the end of the day, humility is key. Now, to make this viewpoint even clearer, the author also explains what it is not. Sometimes understanding what a position rejects is just as helpful as understanding what it affirms. First up is a view called preterism. This is the belief that all those major prophetic events, especially the ones in the book of Revelation, aren't about our future at all. Instead, they were actually fulfilled way back in the past, centering around the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. So why does our source argue against this view? Well, it comes down to a few key points. The first one is just simple timing. The source cites historical evidence that the book of Revelation was written around AD 96. That's almost 3 decades after the temple was destroyed. It also points out that the book itself uses future tense language and describes events on a global scale that just couldn't have happened in the first century. This chart really makes the difference crystal clear. For dispensationalism, Revelation is a prophecy of what's to come. For preterism, it's a history of what's already happened. Where one view sees a future, literal 7-year crisis, the other sees a symbolic fulfillment in Jerusalem's fall. It's a totally different way of reading the entire book. The second view the source rejects is known as dominion theology. This is basically the idea that the church has a job to do to take political and social control over all the world's institutions before Jesus can come back. Now, the author makes a really careful distinction here. They would absolutely agree that the church's mission is to advance a spiritual kingdom, changing hearts, being a positive influence. But, and this is a big but, they are very clear that establishing a literal, physical, governing kingdom on earth, that's a job only Christ himself will do when he returns. And all of this brings us right back to where we started. Whether you subscribe to this specific framework or not, it really forces a fascinating question. How does what someone believes about the future ultimately shape how they live their life today? It suggests that our view of the end of the story is deeply, deeply connected to our sense of purpose in the here and now.